This morning, we are spotlighting the Mica Miller investigation. FBI agents were recently seen searching the home of her widower, who has been questioned about her mysterious death. More than a dozen agents were spotted removing items from the home of Pastor John Paul Miller. This happened on Friday. A crowd of protesters lined up outside of the home to watch all of this happening. And one group of women, they've been following the case and demanding answers. Take a listen.
Waiting 6 months for something to be done, and hopefully justice will come faster and he'll be put in handcuffs and put in jail.
There was a time when Mica Miller seemed to have everything going for her. Bright, ambitious, with a promising future. But that future would change in ways no one could ever imagine. How did a young girl, full of hope, end up trapped in a relationship that would eventually cost her life? How did a man, nearly twice her age, become the center of her world, only to turn it upside down in the most tragic of ways? A love story? Or a ticking time bomb of consequences? What started as a seemingly perfect union soon turned into something much more complex. A story of a woman, a man, and the tangled web they wove, each thread pulling her closer to an untimely end. Was this the tragic outcome of love gone wrong? Or was there more behind her untimely death? Was it fate? Or were there deeper forces at play, pushing her down a path from which there was no return? In this episode, we will uncover the shocking details of Mica's life, from her troubled childhood to the disturbing rise of her marriage with J.P. Miller. We'll follow the twists that led to her sudden death, the current state of it in 2025 and the aftermath that's left many with more questions than answers. Stay with us as we investigate the life and tragic end of Mica Miller. Mica Miller was born in the early 1990s, into what appeared to be a standard, middle-class family. She was the kind of girl who stood out, not just for her beauty, but for her intelligence and ambition. From a young age, Mica was expected to thrive, encouraged by her parents to aim for a bright future. However, beneath the surface, her childhood wasn't as picture-perfect as it seemed. Growing up in a deeply religious environment, Mica often felt torn between the expectations placed upon her and her personal struggles. She wasn't the only one in her family grappling with complex emotions, but her inner turmoil often went unnoticed. Despite outwardly excelling in school and church activities, Mica began to face difficulties at home. She felt misunderstood, and at times, isolated, caught in the expectations of a family that valued image over emotion. Mica Miller began working as a babysitter for John Paul J.P. Miller and his family when she was a teenager. This is how she first came into contact with J.P., who was significantly older than her. Over time, their relationship evolved. Mica's life would take a turn when she met J.P. Miller, a charismatic and well-respected pastor in his late 20s. J.P. was the kind of man who commanded attention. He was successful, had an authoritative presence, and carried the moral weight of his position as a leader in the church community. But what most people didn't know was that his life wasn't as clean-cut as it appeared. He had a troubled past, including a previous marriage and multiple children. Despite the whispers surrounding his history, J.P.'s charm and reputation shielded him from scrutiny. It was during Mica's early teenage years, when she was just 14, that she first met him. At the time, Mica was still figuring out who she was, but there was something about J.P. that made her feel seen. She found herself drawn to him, not just as a mentor, but eventually as something more. Their relationship began in secret, hidden behind the walls of the church where they both sought refuge. For Mica, the attention from an older, influential man filled a void she hadn't known existed. J.P., on the other hand, seemed to have found someone who admired him, someone who looked up to him in ways that his own family never had. As the years went on, their relationship grew more intense. Mica, now in her late teens, became emotionally attached to J.P., despite the obvious age gap and the complicated nature of their connection. He was nearly twice her age, and yet, to Mica, he was everything, a protector, a mentor, and someone who offered the kind of emotional support she'd always craved. However, their relationship wasn't without its challenges. The church community, where both were heavily involved, looked on with suspicion. The difference in their ages, combined with the nature of their relationship, raised eyebrows. But no one could say anything outright. JP had the power to silence critics with a single word, and Mica was too young to understand the weight of the situation. At the age of 18, Mica Miller married her first husband, Robbie Harvey, who according to information, was her high school sweetheart. The officiating pastor for their wedding was Pastor John Paul J.P. Miller. Mica Miller's first marriage ended in divorce due to allegations of infidelity and abuse. In 2015, she was still married to Robbie Harvey when she began an affair with John Paul J.P. Miller. This affair led to the dissolution of the marriage. At that same time, John Paul J.P. Miller's marriage to his ex-wife's name is Allison ended too. She has publicly spoken about her experiences with J.P., including allegations of his abusive behavior. When Mica was 22 years old, they decided to marry. The wedding was everything a young woman could dream of, picturesque, with an idealized version of love playing out in front of their friends and family. It seemed like the fairy tale she had always dreamed of. But behind the smiles and vows, the cracks in their relationship began to show. The age gap between Mica and JP wasn't just a matter of years, it was a constant source of tension. Mica had dreams of her own, ambitions that weren't always aligned with JP's life as a pastor. Over time, the differences in their worldviews became harder to ignore. While JP continued to serve as a revered figure in the church, Mica began to feel like she was losing her identity. Still, she was deeply devoted to him. She believed in their relationship, in the vows they had made, and in the commitment she had given him. But devotion, as Mica would learn, wasn't always enough to overcome the growing strain that began to take a toll on her mental health. As the years passed, Mica's inner struggles became more apparent. She faced bouts of depression, mood swings, and anxiety that seemed to intensify after their marriage. She felt overwhelmed by the pressure to uphold the perfect image of a pastor's wife, to meet the expectations placed on her while battling the demons she kept hidden from those around her. It wasn't just the church that weighed heavily on Mica's shoulders, it was the unraveling of her marriage. JP's past, his complex family life, and his increasing emotional distance only added to her inner turmoil. She felt trapped. Torn between loyalty to her husband and the desire to find herself again, Mica was on the verge of something she couldn't fully understand, a deepening crisis that would eventually push her beyond what she could bear. As the years went by, those close to Mica began to notice subtle changes in her behavior. She wasn't the same young, vibrant woman who had walked into the marriage with so much promise. Family members, friends, and even mentors saw her withdrawal, her exhaustion, the way she seemed to shrink in the presence of her husband. There were moments when she seemed like the old Mica, the smart, driven girl full of dreams, but those moments grew fewer and further between. Still, despite all the signs, Mica remained committed to her marriage, believing it was just a phase, a tough time that would pass. She never imagined it would all come to a head in the way it did, or that the very man she trusted with her life would play a central role in her ultimate fate. As the years passed, the cracks in Mica's marriage to JP began to widen, slowly at first, but with each passing day, they grew deeper, until they could no longer be ignored. At the beginning, Mica was in love with the man who had once been her mentor, her protector, the one she believed she could trust with every piece of herself. But slowly, the weight of that relationship began to bear down on her. What she had once thought of as a partnership built on love began to feel like a prison, and her personal struggles escalated. Mica had always struggled with her mental health, but after marrying JP, her challenges intensified. The pressures of being the perfect wife to a well-known pastor began to take their toll. The image of her perfect life began to crack, and beneath it, she faced a darkness she could no longer hide. She found herself in the grips of severe mood swings, periods of deep depression, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. There were times when she felt completely disconnected from reality, trapped in a cycle of self-doubt and despair. Her once bright future now felt like an unreachable dream. Her mental health struggles were not new, she had battled depression and anxiety for years, but the isolation of marriage only seemed to make things worse. JP, once her anchor, was becoming increasingly distant, emotionally unavailable. Their once passionate relationship had slowly morphed into something more like a cold, transactional partnership. But Mica couldn't break free. She was emotionally and mentally tethered to him, despite the growing evidence that their marriage was deteriorating. Adding to the pressure was JP's past, one that Mica had never fully understood. JP's first marriage had ended in divorce, and the baggage from that relationship cast a long shadow over their own. Mica had seen glimpses of his bitterness, his unresolved anger toward his ex-wife, the children from that marriage who were now adults but still felt like ghosts in their home. Mica found herself caught in the crossfire of JP's unresolved issues, unable to escape the consequences of his past. As JP's own mental health began to worsen, the tension in their home escalated. He became erratic at times, angry, withdrawn, and unpredictable. What had once been a stable, religious environment was now filled with chaos and emotional strain. Mica's attempts to hold everything together were increasingly met with resistance. The love that had once been the foundation of their relationship was being suffocated by anger, mistrust, and a constant sense of dread. Mica's struggles didn't go unnoticed. Those close to her began to see the changes in her. Friends and family members who had once admired her strength and ambition now watched in helplessness as she became more withdrawn, more dependent on medication to manage her emotional pain. But Mica, afraid of the judgment that came with her struggles, kept most of her pain hidden. She believed that if she just kept going, if she just tried hard enough, things would get better. But they didn't. And then came February 15, 2024, the moment when the tension in Mica's life reached a breaking point. On that fateful day, Mica made a 911 call that would serve as a stark indication of just how bad things had become. She reported harassment from JP, describing an argument between them that had escalated to a point of fear. The call was frantic, her voice trembling as she spoke to the operator. She said she had been threatened by JP, that the situation had turned violent, and that she feared for her safety. She mentioned tire slashing, an incident that suggested someone was intentionally trying to intimidate or harm her. The 911 call was a cry for help, a desperate attempt to break free from the situation she felt trapped in. The officer who arrived on the scene noted the visible distress on Mica's face. She was shaken, clearly exhausted from the emotional and physical strain of her marriage. She had filed a police report detailing harassment and even allegations of physical abuse. This was not just a moment of emotional conflict. It was evidence of a marriage that had turned toxic, leaving Mica physically and emotionally battered. The police report further revealed disturbing details about the tension in the Miller household. Mica had disclosed multiple instances of verbal and emotional abuse, and the records from that day reflected the weight of the situation she was living in. At one point, Mica had even attempted to get a divorce. But her mental health, along with JP's relentless pressure, led her to withdraw the divorce papers before anything could be finalized. Her fear and dependence on him were so overwhelming that she couldn't bring herself to take that step, even though she knew deep down that it might be the only way out. Mica was no longer the young woman who walked down the aisle with hope in her heart. She's become someone completely different, someone struggling to survive each day, just trying to hold on. Her once promising future now seems like a distant memory, something that slipped away along with the love she had once shared with JP. But despite the police report, despite the 911 call and the clear signs that Mica was in danger, things didn't change. JP remained a respected figure in the community, while Mica's pain continued to fester beneath the surface. The truth about what was happening behind closed doors remained obscured by the image JP had worked so hard to maintain. As the days went on, the tension in Mica's life only grew, leaving her to wonder if there was any way out, or if she was destined to live in this toxic, suffocating marriage forever. The question on everyone's mind was this: was there any escape for Mica? Was there someone who could have saved her before it was too late? Or had she already been lost, long before that final fateful day? Her mental health struggles had not only isolated her emotionally, but they also created a deep rift between her and JP. The tension between them escalated, turning their home into a battleground. While Mica struggled to hold on to some semblance of control, JP's emotional neglect and his increasing hostility only added fuel to the fire. What was once a marriage rooted in love had become a prison where both of them seemed locked in a battle neither could win. Mica had been hospitalized multiple times in the past, seeking treatment for her mental health issues, but each time, she found herself back at square one. The attempts to withdraw from her divorce proceedings in the face of her deteriorating mental state only proved how trapped she felt, trapped in a marriage that was only making her worse. She wanted to escape, but at the same time, she couldn't imagine life without the man she had once believed would be her anchor. She felt as though she was teetering on the edge, unable to fully escape, but unwilling to face the agony any longer. The final moments of Mica's life were marked by an event that would send shockwaves through the people closest to her. On a cold April day in 2024, Mica made another 911 call. This time, it wasn't a call about harassment, about threats, or about an argument. It was a call for help in the truest sense, a cry for intervention before she followed through on a decision she had been wrestling with for months. She dialed 911 in a moment of deep despair, telling the operator exactly what she planned to do. She gave her location, her voice shaky and filled with a hollow sense of finality. Mica made it clear that she was not calling for someone to resolve the issues that plagued her life, she had already made up her mind. She was calling to make sure someone would find her. But by the time help arrived, it was too late. The search for Mica turned into a frantic race against time. The community, already grieving the loss of the young woman they had all watched struggle in silence, now rallied together to find her. Volunteers scoured the area where she had last been seen, searching through the woods and fields, desperate to bring her home. It wasn't until hours later that they discovered her body. Mica Miller's body was discovered on April 27, 2024, at Lumber River State Park in North Carolina. A fisherman named Johnny Jacobs, who was fishing nearby, heard a gunshot and then found Mica's belongings near the water's edge. He reported his findings to authorities, leading them to locate her body in the water. Her last choice, a quiet corner to leave the world behind, hoping for an escape from the pain that no one could heal. The exact reasons why Mica Miller chose Lumber River State Park as the location for her death remain unclear, as her family and friends have consistently maintained that they believe her death was a result of abuse, not suicide. The location where her body was found, near water and in a somewhat isolated area, has fueled suspicion and led many to question the circumstances surrounding her death. Some speculate that Mica may have felt trapped and alone, potentially seeking a place where she could be away from others. His voice trembled as he spoke, trying to hold it together as he shared the devastating news that Mica had taken her life. He described her as a beautiful, vibrant woman, someone who had battled against a darkness she could never fully escape. His words seemed hollow, distant, as though he were reading from a script rather than speaking from the heart. The congregation, many of whom had known Mica personally, stood in stunned silence. Some questioned whether JP truly understood the gravity of what he was saying. Others felt an eerie disconnect between his words and the haunting reality of their shared history. The moment was uncomfortable, unsettling. The man who had stood by Mica's side for years, a man who had helped lead the church, was now telling the congregation that the woman they all cared for was gone, taking her life in a place and manner that felt eerily deliberate. The tension in the room was thick, and as JP spoke, it was clear that there was no sense of closure for anyone who had known Mica. Instead, there were more questions than answers. The churchgoers, who had once seen JP as a figure of strength and guidance, now wondered about his role in Mica's death. How could a man so close to her, so deeply involved in her life, make this announcement with such a clinical detachment? How could he stand there and speak of her death in such a detached manner, when those who knew her best were still grappling with the pain of her passing? While the congregation tried to process the news, the questions surrounding Mica's death only grew louder. Was it really suicide? Could a man who had so much influence over her life, who had witnessed her struggles firsthand, be as innocent as he appeared? Or did his involvement, through years of emotional neglect and abuse, play a part in her tragic end? The investigation continued, but the public's focus on JP only intensified. The announcement at the church, seemingly designed to ease the grief of the community, instead served to raise even more troubling questions. Had he played a part in Mica's final moments? Was his cold, emotionless delivery a sign of guilt, or simply the numbness of a man who had lost control of a life he could no longer contain? The tragic death of Mica Miller was only the beginning of a bitter, prolonged fight for justice that would consume her family and leave more unanswered questions in its wake. What had seemed like a straightforward case of a woman who tragically lost her battle with mental illness quickly escalated into a complex web of legal disputes, accusations of abuse, and an ongoing battle.